Welcome to Midweek Murders, where we take a look at true crime around Australia. In this week's episode, we check out the third and last woman hanged in Fremantle Prison. Today, we look at the wicked stepmother of East Perth. Martha Rendell was born in August 1871. While she was called the wicked stepmother of East Perth, Martha was born in Adelaide, South Australia. Knowing that makes much more sense for her cruelty, but that serial killer is for another week. While in Adelaide, Martha met Thomas Nichols Morris and followed him to the west. Mr. Morris had custody of his 4 children after his wife left him to live elsewhere. When Martha moved in, she posed as the wife and the children were forced to call her mother. All the children were brutally abused by Martha, who would take them to see doctors. Despite the number of times the children were seen, only one doctor expressed doubts about their deaths. And while he was given permission to perform an autopsy on one of the children, he found nothing untoward. There were reports that not only was Martha slowly poisoning the children, but that she took great pleasure in physically harming them, once beating young Annie so violently that she couldn't walk. Arresting Officer Inspector Harry Mann said she delighted in seeing her victims writhe in agony, and also claimed that she derived sexual pleasure from it. 9-year-old Annie was the first victim of Martha Rendell. She would put something in the child's drink which would cause a sore throat. There were accusations that she was swabbing the back of their throats with spirits of salts, more commonly known as hydrochloric acid, claiming that it was medicine. This would inflame the throat to the point that the child could no longer eat and would starve to death. Annie died on the 28th of July 1907. The cause of death was marked down as diphtheria. After Annie, Martha turned to 7-year-old Olive. In the same year as her older sister, Olive succumbed to the torture, passing away on the 16th of October 1907. Martha then moved on to 15-year-old Arthur. He took much longer than his youngest sister to succumb, but he ultimately passed away less than a year later on October 8th, 1908. Dr. Cuthbert, who had been the attending physician for all the children and the only doctor to have any doubts about their deaths, asked permission to perform an autopsy on Arthur. Martha agreed as long as she was present during the investigation. The doctors found nothing to incriminate her. Believing she was free from the investigation, Martha turned her sights onto the remaining child, George, in 1909. After having a cup of tea, George complained of a sore throat and Martha rubbed something on his tonsils. This terrified George and made him run away to his mother's house some streets away. When the neighbours inquired as to where George was, his father, Thomas Morris, stated that he didn't know. The investigation began after numerous reports from neighbours. The neighbours reported the visible discomfort of the children and the indifference of Martha for their well-being. Inspector Mann located George, who claimed that he had run away because his stepmother was trying to kill him, as she had done with his siblings. Due to the time that had elapsed and the lack of knowledge about hydrochloric acid on the throat from the doctors, the inquiry was hampered. Suspicions were further aroused when it was shown that Martha had purchased large quantities of spirits of salts before the deaths, and none after the final victim. With that knowledge, the detectives obtained permission to have the bodies of the 3 children exhumed. On July 3rd, 1909, the bodies were exhumed and diluted hydrochloric acid was found on the throat tissue. In the Supreme Court of Western Australia, the trial of willful murder against Martha Rendell and Thomas Morris began on September 7th, 1909. 7 days later, Rendell was found guilty by a jury of her peers. She proclaimed her innocence, insisting that she was treating the children for diphtheria. Thomas Morris was acquitted, as it was believed that while he had purchased the spirits of salts, he had no idea what Martha was doing until after the deaths. At 8 a.m. on October 6, 1909, Martha Rendell was hanged in Fremantle Prison, drawing in a crowd of 25, the largest any execution in Fremantle had seen. She was buried in Fremantle Cemetery. Over 50 years later, serial killer Eric Edgar Cook would be buried in the same plot. Martha Rendell was the third and last woman hanged in the prison. An illusion appears on one of the windows at the Fremantle Prison, which can only be seen from the outside. If you ever happen to visit Western Australia, I highly recommend taking the night tour of the prison. It's a beautiful building with a wonderful history. Thank you for tuning into Midweek Murders. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will have links in the description box below if you wish to read more about Martha Rendell. Until next week, stay safe.